to the Innocence Project, innocent people have made false confessions in about 25% of their successful cases. And then add bias on top and you might be surprised just how many people have gone to prison for a crime they didn't commit. Well, today we're diving into some of the most insane cases I could find, and you will be shocked to hear how long some of these people were behind bars. Starting us off at number 10, James Richardson. Back in 1967, this man was wrongfully convicted for poisoning and killing 7 of his young family members. The day the crime took place, the babysitter, named Bessie Reese, had been watching them, and despite her being home with them at the time of the killings, and being a convicted killer on parole for taking her ex-husband's life, Richardson was still blamed. During his trial, it became very clear that the jury, as well as the local law enforcement, were not treating him fairly. Richardson would tell his lawyer about one of the officers on the case routinely calling him slurs and being cruel during questioning. Richardson claims he was often told just to admit he was guilty to get a shorter sentence, but he refused to admit to something he didn't do. During trial, it was revealed that the night before the incident, he had been looking into life insurance policies, and that mixed with the fact that he was a black man in 1967 with an all-white jury was enough for them to think he was guilty. Richardson was initially sentenced with the death penalty, but 21 years later, after a new look into the case, it was revealed it had been an extremely unfair trial and that no proper investigations were done. Richardson was clearly innocent, and it had been the babysitter all along. Now out and free as he always should have been, he will be rewarded $50,000 for each year of his wrongful imprisonment. Next up at number 9, Sunny Jacobs. In 1976, while driving with her young kids, both Sunny and her husband, Jesse Tefero, were arrested after they were believed to be responsible for killing a police officer along with a friend, Walter Rhodes. Now, Rhodes had been the only one who tested positive for gunpowder residue, but after he agreed to testify against Sunny and Jesse so that he could receive a lighter sentence instead of the death penalty, he threw his dear friends under the bus. Both Sunny and Jesse were sentenced to death, and Jacobs spent the next 5 years in solitary confinement away from her entire family and the life she knew. She was adamant to remain as positive as she could and would practice yoga every day, reminding herself that if people survived World War II camps, that she could surely survive this. In 1981, the Supreme Court adjusted Sunny's sentence to life after it was uncovered that Rhodes lied and that it was he and not the couple who had pulled the trigger. But sadly, Jesse received no such deal and was still sentenced to the electric chair in 1990, which made headlines as the chair caught on fire during the execution and he suffered a long 13-minute demise. In 1992, enough evidence was brought forward to overturn Sunny's conviction, and 16 years after being arrested, she was finally set free. Sadly, she had to go into this new world without her husband and a practical stranger to her family, but after some time she reconnected with her loved ones and now lives a happy life. Next up at number 8, David Ranta. In 1990, there was a tragic case where a criminal tried to rob a jewelry courier before hitting him with a car. Upon fleeing the scene, the perp also shot and killed a rabbi who had been a survivor of a World War II camp, then stole his car and drove off. The public was up in arms, understandably, about the entire ordeal and wanted answers fast. In came the controlled choice of David Ranta, who was sentenced to 37 years for a crime he was innocent of. Now, investigators insist that they never set out to frame anyone for the killing, but the optics are not good. First, Ranta always denied having any involvement in the case, and while of course that isn't something that you can trust as a judge, Ranta was tricked into signing a confession by investigators, and it was revealed later that much of the paperwork was missing. Further, a witness came forward in 2011 claiming that they had been coached into choosing him from a lineup, and despite the fact that he was only chosen in one of the 5 lineups and that the courier insisted it was not Ranta who had tried to rob him, they still found him guilty. Thankfully, after serving 23 years, the case was reviewed and a judge confirmed it had been an unfair trial, clearly with some underlying motive. She apologized for him being put away as an innocent man, and Ranta will receive $6.4 million for his wrongful conviction. Coming in at number 7, Rubin Carter. While Rubin Carter grew up to be a good innocent man, he had a troubled childhood that led him into some bad crowds. In 1948, he was sentenced to a juvie center for assault after stabbing someone that he claimed was trying to commit SA. Then in 1954, he left the center and joined the army, but after 2 years, he was discharged after being declared unfit for service and sent back to the States, where shortly after he went to prison for 2 separate muggings. But after his release in 1961, he wanted to turn his life around. Having found an interest in the army, he became a professional boxer and got his nickname the Hurricane. He in fact had a really lucrative career, and by 1965 was rated the top 5 fighter in middleweight. But sadly, one night would take it all away. In 1966, 2 black men entered a bar and shot and killed 3 people. 10 minutes after the incident, police stopped a rental car being driven by John Artis, and Carter was in the back seat with another friend. But despite witnesses saying that the getaway car had just 2 black men both sitting in the front seat, evidence was muddled and the 2 were still arrested. Carter and Artis were both sentenced to life in prison, and even after a retrial the year after, their sentences remained upheld. Eventually, after 19 years behind bars, a judge overturned his conviction and Carter moved to Toronto and became an activist for those who had been wrongfully convicted. Bob Dylan even wrote a song called Hurricane after him. Next up at number 6, William Dillon. In 1981, a man was brutally beaten to death in a wooded area near Canova Beach in Florida. Later that morning, a man wearing a t-shirt covered in blood was seen hitchhiking by the woods, and when he was picked up, he asked to be driven to a nearby tavern. Meanwhile, Dillon was miles away from the entire thing. Still, he got entangled in the case and became the prime suspect after a scent tracking dog linked Dillon to the t-shirt after it was found in the trash. During trial, Dillon's ex-girlfriend testified against him, saying that she had been with him on the night of the crime and had seen him standing over the body. Then the driver, who is legally blind in one eye, identified Dillon as the hitchhiker despite previous descriptions not remotely matching Dillon's appearance. Dillon maintained his innocence, but still 5 days later he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, less than 2 weeks after the trial, his ex-girlfriend recanted her testimony. She said she had made up the whole story after officers had threatened her with 25 years in prison if she didn't testify. And to make matters worse, it was discovered that she and the lead officer had an intimate relation during the investigation. After 23 years behind bars, Dillon was finally exonerated after a DNA test proved he had no link to the crimes, and in 2012, Dillon received $1.3 million in compensation. Coming in at number 5, Dewey Bozella. In his early years, Bozella witnessed and suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of his father. Tragically, he even witnessed his own mother's death, who was killed by his father. In his youth, he was sent to live in a group home, but started getting into trouble and mixing with the bad crowd. Eventually, he found boxing, and it seemed like maybe his life was going to turn around. But in 1983, his life was stolen from him after he was arrested and convicted for killing a 92-year-old woman that police believed he shot after trying to rob her house. Bozella never once strayed from protesting his innocence, even after 4 parole hearings that all claimed admittance of guilt could help him. But he had a different plan. Behind bars, Bozella decided to study the legal system and became a certified paralegal to prove his innocence once and for all. Finally, he was able to reach out to the Innocence Project, who referred him to a new lawyer. His new representation discovered that evidence had been suppressed by prosecutors during the initial trial that in fact proved his innocence and proved he had been framed. In 2009, after serving 26 years, he was finally set free, and in 2011 his dreams came true and he finally had his first professional boxing match. Next up at number 4, James Bain. In 1974, a young boy was kidnapped from his home before being dragged into a baseball field and brutally taken advantage of by a man the boy described as having bushy sideburns and a mustache. A relative of the victim thought the description sounded like James Bain, and when the victim was given 5 photos of potential attackers, he chose the photo of Bain. At the time of his arrest, Bain had no previous criminal record and insisted that he was at home with his sister at the time of the attack, but still the trial went forward. According to the FBI, FBI, the assailant left semen on the victim's underwear, but sadly at the time of the trial, DNA testing was not available. What they did instead was test his blood group. The perp was from blood group B, and despite Bain being group AB, which should have excluded him, the analyst claimed he had a weak A and therefore was still a viable option. This was disproved by another expert who said that Bain actually had a really strong A and should have therefore been excluded. But wanting to put someone behind bars for the crime, Bain was sentenced to life. In 2001, Bain started petitioning to get DNA testing done, and thankfully by 2005, after being picked up by the Innocence Project, his wish was granted. By 2009, the DNA showed definitively that there was no match between Bain and the perp, so after 35 long years in prison, he was finally set free with a $1.75 million compensation for his wrongful conviction. Next up at number 3, Louis Taylor. At just 16, Louis Taylor was accused of setting fire to an Arizona hotel that ended up killing 28 people back in 1970. From the get-go, Taylor was adamant about his innocence, but since he was nearby the incident when it happened, and he was dealing with racist officers who quite literally said that black boys like to set fires and used that as grounds in court, he was convicted for arson and sentenced to 28 consecutive life sentences. The saddest part is that not only was Taylor innocent, but he was only near the fire as he was actually trying to help people escape from the burning building, but happened to have matches in his pocket upon the arrest, so police just assumed it was him. 42 years later, it was uncovered the fire may have actually not even been caused intentionally, and it certainly wasn't caused by Taylor. Although free, Taylor's case doesn't have quite the same happy ending, as he received no compensation for the 42 years away based on a technicality of his plea deal. Coming in at number 2, Michael Morton. In 1986, Morton lived a normal life. He had a wife and a family, a normal car, and everything short of the picket fence. But after his wife was bludgeoned to death in the couple's bed, he became the prime suspect, and his life was anything from normal ever again. The day after Christine's body was found, police discovered a post-it on the mirror with a cheeky note about his disappointment of not being intimate the night prior. But the note didn't have any kind of dark tone, and it even ended in saying, "I love you." Morton's son had actually been home at the time of the attack, and he insisted on his father's innocence, saying Daddy was not home, it was a monster who did it. There was tons of evidence pointing towards a different perp, like Christine's missing credit cards being found with strange charges, and neighbors witnessing a green van beside the house and a strange man walking off into a nearby wooded area. But evidence concerning the son's eyewitness account, the green van, and Christine's credit cards were all absent from the records given to the judge. The prosecution presented no witnesses or evidence that tied Morton to the crime, but they deduced that he had killed Christine because she refused to sleep with him the night prior to her death. So on February 17th, 1987, Michael Morton was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In 2005, the Innocence Project got involved, and after finally getting clearance to run testing in 2011, they discovered an already convicted felon had been responsible all along, and Morton was finally released after 25 years. Last up today in our number 1 spot, we have Richard Phillips. Phillips grew up in an unfortunately poor and crime-filled area of Detroit. His whole life he suffered unending abuse from his stepfather, and he often would try to run away from home but was always brought back by the police. In his teens, he became friends with a guy named Fred Mitchell, and the two started skipping school, messing around with BB guns, and just overall getting into trouble. But Phillips decided to take a different path in life, and as he got older, he got a good job, met a girl, they started a family together. Life was good until 1971, when he got fired from his job after he was falsely accused of burning someone with a cigarette. At this same time, his old friend Mitchell was on parole and brought with him a new friend from prison, Dago. Phillips got mixed up with him and started to fall into old habits, turning to a secret life of substance abuse. Then, one night after two men committed an armed robbery at a convenience store, his life changed forever. They knew it was a white man and a black man, and Dago was already confirmed in the crime, but there was debate if the second robber was Phillips or Mitchell. After a lineup, witnesses confirmed it was Phillips, and shortly after he was sentenced to life in prison. After a very long 46 years behind bars, Dago finally admitted that Mitchell had been his accomplice and that he hadn't even met Phillips until 8 days after the crime had happened. Phillips finally walked free after a near half-century in prison. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'm Kennedy. If you liked this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button. See you next time.